Welcome to IMPRI Web Policy Talk. I may request our moderator for today, Dr. Simi Mehta, to start with the proceedings. Thank you.
Simi, unaudible. Try again. No problem. Simi is having some glitches. So let me start the program. So welcome everyone to this event, the State of Employment, #Employment Debate, which is organized by Center for Work and Welfare at Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi, Working People's Charter, and Counterview. The topic of today's talk is Brazilian labor market amid the coronavirus pandemic, impact and the way forward, which is being delivered by Dr. Ian Prates, who is a researcher at Brazilian Center of Analysis and Planning. Simi, are you there?
Yes.
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you very much, Ritika, Dr. Arjun. I welcome all of you from India. A very good evening. And as Dr. Arjun was mentioning, that the special speaker for today, this evening, is Dr. Ian Prates. And it is my heartfelt gratitude to all the panelists on behalf of Impact and Policy Research Institute, Center for Work and Welfare, Counterview, and Working People's Charter this evening. And I welcome all of you. It is my great delight to introduce to you the chair for today, Professor Dev Nathan, who is a professor at the Institute for Human Development, New Delhi, and is also a visiting research fellow at Duke University in USA. He is the coordinator of the IDRC-supported South Asia Research Network on Employment and Social Protection. He was one of the research coordinators of the multi-country research project on capturing the gains, economic and social upgrading in global production. And his research interests include labor in global production, gender relations, and development issues of indigenous peoples. He has published extensively, authored, co-authored, edited, and co-edited several books, and some of which include Markets and Region and Indigenous Peoples in Asia, published by Oxford University Press, and Labor in Global Production Networks in India, again published by Oxford University Press. It is our privilege to have you this evening, sir. And I welcome you to make your opening remarks. Over to you.
Okay, I'm sorry I was cut off, so I didn't quite hear what happened before this.
Sir, I was introducing you.
Okay, but have you introduced our speaker, Dr.
No,
Prates?
after your permission, sir, if you could just...
Okay, yeah, okay, so we will begin now. And I think first if you introduce Dr. Prates and let's say a few words about him and his work, and then we can go on with his presentation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor. It is now my delight to introduce to you Professor Ian Prates. He is a member of the coordinator committee of the Solidarity Research Network for Public Policies and Society, and the coordinator of the labor market and social policies research projects of the network. He is a researcher at the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning and a research fellow at the Social Accountability International. His research has focused on social inequalities with a focus on labor market, social protection, poverty, and social stratification, and the political economy of China and Latin America relationships. He has a PhD in sociology from the University of Sao Paulo and has been a visiting scholar in Columbia University. Today, he is going to speak on the Brazilian labor market amid the coronavirus pandemic, impact and the way forward. Thank you very much, Dr. Ian, and I welcome you on behalf of all of us. I now invite you to make your presentation.
Well, thank you. I would like to thank Professor Kumar for the invitation and the Institute as well, and all the colleagues in this virtual table. And I'm very pleased to present the work we have been done in the Solidarity Research Network. We started this initiative in the beginning of the pandemic to try to understand the impacts of the pandemic, the socioeconomic impacts in the pandemic, and I've been in charge of the projects of labor market and social policies. I think the pandemic brought us a huge challenge related to the data analysis, because usually when we work with labor market and when we work with inequalities and so on, for example, we are here in 2020 and we use it to use a 2019 labor force survey, something like this, and then we publish that paper and so on. But nothing of this matters in the pandemic. The data from 2019, it's not important for us now. We have to understand now what's going on. So we had a big challenge to have data and to analyze the data in a very, very fast way. So fortunately, Brazil and the Brazilian Statistical Institute has been very, and also the Ministry of Labor of Brazil, they have been very efficient in providing data during the pandemic. So I'm very glad that we could analyze the data and that we could find we have some findings to show you here, and I'm sure we will have a delightful discussion in the next hours, in the next minutes. So I will start to share my screen here and to start my presentation. Just let me know if it's fine.
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, thank you. Well, so I start with my outline. I think it's very important to, before we go through the impacts of the pandemic itself, it's important to understand what was going on with labor market inequality and the social protection in Brazil before the pandemic, because of course the pandemic has similar effects in different countries, but all these effects, especially due to the lockdown policies and because of the economic crisis, of course, but all these impacts, they will depend on the path of the labor market and of the social protection and of the institutions in each country themselves. So I will start with this in Brazil, showing what was going on before the pandemic, because I think all this trend shapes strongly the pandemic's impacts. Then I will come to the socioeconomic impacts themselves and the policy response that the government tried to mitigate the negative impacts of the pandemic. And to finish, I will show you some data on telework and digital inequalities to have some discussion on the future of the work and the challenge ahead. That is a very important agenda of the International Labour Organization on these days. Well, it was before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic just accelerated the need for discussion regarding the digital technologies and the impact of platforms in labor market and so on. Well, so what was going on in Brazil? I think this graph, it illustrates a lot the trend of labor market in Brazil over the past 40 years. Here we have the Gini coefficient of the labor income from 1976 to 2019. We can observe that during the 80s and the 90s, we had a great instability. And after the 2000s, we had a huge decrease in the Gini coefficient. This means that we have good policies related to the labor market, a trend of formalization, the increase of the real increase of the minimum wage values. And this lasts till 2015, when we started a big and huge crisis that is affecting Brazilian labor market till now. And since 2015, the inequality in labor market started to rise again. So 2015 is a turning point and the end of a cycle of equalization within the Brazilian labor market. And this is very important to understand the effects on the pandemic and on families and on households and on society in a general way. So if we take a look closer to the period to 2012 to 2019, we can see how the unemployment rate reached the peak in 2017, reaching almost 15% of the labor force. And the informality also, after decrease to 2014, started to rise again, right? So this is a mirror of the economic crisis and how the economic crisis affected Brazil after 2015. What was the main impacts on families? Again, after 2014, the household income per capita started to decrease. And 2017, 18, and 19, we started a small recovery. Yeah, you can see that the household per capita income starts to increase again. And the same happens with the Gini coefficient for household income per capita. Well, this data would suggest that since 2018, we are experimenting a recovery, or the economic is recovering. This is true, but not 100% true, because for the poorest 20% of the population in Brazil and for the poorest 20% of workers in Brazil, the crisis never finished, to be honest. So here we have the growth incidence curve. That is, this just means the average mean of the income in each percentile in 2014 divided by the average mean of the income of the same percentile in 2012. If it's higher than 1, it means that this population within this percentile is increased their income. It's lower than 1, the income decreased, right? So we can see that between 2012 and 2014, the poorest ones, they increased their income related to the richer ones. On the other side, when you look to 2015 and 2018 period, we can see a huge drop in the income of the poorer ones, and that the richer ones, they increase their income. What does it mean? That between 2000, when we sum both graphs, what do we have? We can see that half or the bottom 50% of the income distribution, they lost from 2012 to 2018. And 2019 is the same. We just analyzed this data a couple of days ago, but it's the same trend. So the most important point here that I would like to highlight is that the pandemic arrives in Brazil in a moment when the bottom 50% of the population is losing. So even though the economic crisis itself had gone after 2018 and 19, we had a small economic growth, and during 2018 and 2019, this is not true for the bottom half of the society. Okay, so why did this happen? Well, this is not an effect of just the economic crisis. This is also an effect of how the social policies have been managed over these years. Here we have some data regarding the main Brazilian cash transfer program, that's Bolsa Família program, right? So in the top left, we have the total budget of the program. You can see that in 2004, it started with 0.5 billion Brazilian reais per month, and it reaches around 2 in 2014, and since then it starts to decrease the budget of the program. The same in the number of the families that are beneficiaries from the program. It increases till 2014, a lot of new beneficiaries, and then it starts to decrease. Here we have a huge drop and increase again, but since Bolsonaro government, it has a huge drop. Around 1.5 million families were excluded from the program. Here we have the number of families beneficiaries. Here we have in the top, in the bottom left, we have the average benefit per family, and we can see also the same trend. The benefit, the value of the benefit increased till 2014 and then decreased since then. And here we have the poverty line. What we can see here, the actual value of the poverty line, the real value, right? So what we can see is that the poverty line has not been updated for a long time. So we have now a lower poverty line for the program, a lower threshold. So this means that we have less families able to receive the benefit. Well, this is not a result from the economic crisis. This is a result from policy choices, right? When we have an economic crisis that affects the poorest ones in a disproportionate manner, we should expect the opposite. We should expect the counter-cycle policies and the social policies increasing their effect on benefiting the poorest ones. But what we observe is that exactly the opposite. When we face economic crisis, the social policies also have been suffering from a huge drop. So the same we can see in the unemployment insurance coverage rate. This is just for formal labor market. This huge drop here is due to some formal changes and rules to access the benefit. So exactly during the crisis, the government decided to make the rules more restrict, so less workers had the right to the access to the benefits, and then we can see that the trend is to a lower coverage rate. Well, the result, what's the result in terms of poverty, is that since then we are experimenting an increase in poverty in Brazil. Here we have poverty rates according to 3 different poverty lines from the World Bank: 5.5 ppb day, 3.2 ppb day, and 1.9 ppb day. The trend is the same. Well, just to sum up this introduction, so what do we have? Regarding labor market and poverty, we have been experimenting a rise in unemployment and informality. The poverty is increasing steadily. And to social policies, we have a trend of mercantilization of the social policies and a reduction in the coverage of anti-poverty programs and unemployment insurance. So this is how the pandemic arrives in Brazil. Well, and considering all these trends, what was the main pandemic impacts? In my opinion, this graph illustrates, and it is if I had to choose one image from the pandemic in Brazil, I would choose this graph. This graph is the employment to population rate trend since 2012 to 2020. In the gray line, we have the labor force survey trend, and this black dot is the specific labor force survey during the pandemic. So for the first time in the Brazilian history, we have less than 50% of the working age population working. Why did I choose the employment population rate instead of unemployment rate? Well, because I think all of you know that due to the lockdown policies, a lot of workers, they had to leave the labor market. So they are not considered officially unemployed person, but they are considered person economically inactively or outside of the labor force because they can't seek for jobs, right? And here we have this figure again. In just 1 month, 10 million of workers left the labor force during the pandemic in Brazil. So this is from March 2020 to April 2020. This is the number of workers in the labor force since 2012. This is just a demographic trend. It increased over the years because of a demographic trend, more people in working age population. This is perfectly normal and increase till the beginning of 2020, and 1 month it comes to the same level of almost 10 years before. What's the result of this? That if we look to the traditional unemployment rate, that is the rate which considers the workers who are not working but are seeking for a job, we have 12% unemployment rate. However, if we consider those who are not in the labor force just because of the pandemic, and we have this question in the labor force survey, why didn't you seek for a job in the past week? And the interviewed, it has the option to respond. I didn't seek for a job because of the pandemic. Because the pandemic, I had to stay at home and I couldn't look for a job. These are 15% of the labor force. So the real unemployment in Brazil nowadays, if we consider those ones who can't seek for a job, is 27.7%. It's more than a quarter of the working age population. Well, this is quite a huge impact in the Brazilian labor markets. So considering all these trends, what were the main policies to fight these consequences? The Brazilian government, and when I say Brazilian government, I'm talking about also the president, but also the Congress, because since we live in a federative republic, the Congress also has a huge impact on how policies are decided. The first one, it was the emergency basic income. The main goal is to guarantee income for informal workers, unemployment, and poor families. It reaches around 60 million beneficiaries. That is closer to, it's not 1/3 of the Brazilian population, but maybe the Brazilian population is 2010 million. So it's a little bit less than 1/3 of the Brazilian population. And the cash transfer, it was $110 per month during the first 3 months and $55 per month in the last 3 months. And December now is the last month of the benefit. The other policy we had, it was a specific policy to formal labor market. So the first one, it was directed to informal labor market and to poor families. And the second one, it was targeted especially to the formal labor market. So it was to formal workers in the private sector. We had around 11 million contracts or contract suspension or working hours reduction with salary reduction. In this case, the federal government pays a complementary benefit. So the government pays for the employees and employers who make an agreement to avoid layoffs. Well, these two were the main policies during the pandemic. A third and very important policy that's not specifically related to labor market, but to the economy as in general, it was the credit policy, but this one didn't work very well. The credit took a long time to reach especially the small companies, and this had a huge impact in the efficiency of this specific policy for the formal labor market. So when we look to the impacts of both trends, right? So we have the trend of the unemployment, the people going out the labor force, companies bankrupting, and so on. But on the other side, we have a very generous benefit. Well, in this purple bar, we have how much the household income dropped due just to the drop in the labor income. And we can see that the labor income, it was responsible for almost 300 reais around $55 in the average income of households. On the other side, here in this light green, we have the effect of the emergency basic income. So it was around 100 reais. And what this graph shows, it shows that the social policy and the basic income, it was far from compensate the drop and the effect, the negative effect on the labor market. It's so if here the drops around 300, here we have an increase around 100, and the net result is about 200 of losses in the family's income per capita. And here, but here we have the effect of the variation in per capita household income by the position in the income distribution. So here we have the richest ones in the 100, and 0 are the poorest ones. Here are the percentiles, the quantiles. What we can observe in this graph, that if it were not for the benefits and for the emergence benefits, the yellow line would be the real income of families during the pandemic. You can see here a drop in almost 40%, and for those in the 20% bottom, around 100 or 8% of income losses. But with benefits, what we see is that actually the 20% bottom, the ones who are in poverty before the pandemic, their income increased during the pandemic. This makes a lot of sense because the value of the benefits is a very generous value. So the value itself, the $110 is much higher than the poverty line. So what this make that the 20% bottom during the pandemic, they had a higher income than before the pandemic. But of course, we have to remember the point I made before. The benefit will finish in December. So this is not a real and a structural change. This is just something that was made for emergency, and after from January onwards, we have the tendency that the yellow line will be the reality of the Brazilian families in the next months. Well, so the per capita household income decreased around 220 Brazilian reais, which means a monthly drop of around 46 billion in the national economy monthly. Well, here we are just multiplying 220 per 210, that's the Brazilian population, and we reach this drop, this huge drop in the economy. And of this total, approximately 80% is due to drop in the labor income. So what I see is that I think this is what happened in most countries of the world, right? The labor market and effects in labor market are the main mechanism by which the pandemic affected families and affected income and affected families' income. However, we know that the effects are different for social groups, right? And I just would like to highlight some recent results we have found when we differentiate all of these results according to race and to gender. So what we can see, the reduction of 13%, 13.4% in the number of the employed Black people against 7.3% of white people. In the same direction, we have 11.8% of employed women against 9.8% of men. And although more than a half of those employed before the pandemic were Black, around 54%, Black accounts for more than 2/3 of people who lost their jobs. And again, to a result that affects especially women and is related to the distribution of the care activities, I think. Of the women who did not seek employment during the pandemic, 16.7% did not do so because they had to take care of household activities or relatives. against just 1% of men. So here we are showing how the pandemic actually increased how the care activities within households affects women in a disproportional way related to men. But we know that old inequalities meet new ones, right? The pandemic did not just increase the inequalities we already have. It created new inequalities. And I think there's something that has been very evident during the pandemic is the inequalities related to digital access and to the ICTs. So here we have a graph that we compare the working at home during the pandemic in Brazil, Chile, and the European Union. I'm very interested if the colleagues, they have some data of India to share, we can think about something, because I think we need to compare this kind of data. So in Brazil, just 10% of the workers during the pandemic were working at home. Here we have most of countries are from the European Union, but if we take Chile, that's a country that, well, it's richer than Brazil, but is a country that's similar to Brazil somehow. We have twice of workers working from home. But of course, this is not equally distributed, right? When we take a look in the occupational structure of the home-based work, and then we compare data from 2019 and from the pandemic, the results are quite astonishing. Before the pandemic, people who used to work at home, were the lower occupations. So we have tailors, dressmakers, salesperson, bakers, cookers, and so on. So the structure of the home-based work changed because of the pandemic. And when we compare 2019 with 2020, what we can see is that professionals who didn't use to work from home, who didn't use to use ICT and digital technologies to do their work, they start to work. So during the pandemic, we had around 23.5% of people who were working from home. They were higher education professionals, lawyers, engineers, the traditional professions, teachers, and then we have all the other occupations. Well, this is a huge difference, right? I think this brings to us how the pandemic is affecting the way people are doing their jobs and how technologies itself are affecting the labor market. And here we have a similar data. We have an error here. It's not correct. I'm sorry for that. This May 2020. This should be the number of armed force, but fine. We have the percentage of people working from home before the pandemic and during the pandemic by occupational group. So again, we can see that managers and directors and professionals, here is the ISCO 88 categories. It was just a few. We had 2%, 4%, 3.8%. And during the pandemic, this increased to 26%, 40%, almost 13%. And here we have the difference in percentages, right? So again, this shows very clearly how the home-based works and how technology is affecting occupations and is affecting workers' lives and the exercise of work. The final result of this trend, here we have 4 categories. The purple one is people who continue to work in person during the pandemic. The blue one is the employed teleworker. The green one are the open unemployment, and the yellow one, the hidden unemployment, is the one that I told before. That is the workers who could not work because of the pandemic. And in the bottom, in the x-axis, we have the per capita household income. So here we have the richest ones, and here we have the poorest ones. It's not a surprise that we can see that the telework affects much more the ones in the welfare distribution. But on the other side, we can see that the hidden unemployment affects much more the poorest ones. Well, this is not, we can say that this is not new, this is expected somehow, but this is expected, but this is shaped by the way the digital inequalities are distributed among the Brazilian labor force. And I think this is an agenda that we need to pay attention in the next years. Well, so I'll finish with, I think my time is finishing. One more minute. I don't have any more to show. I just think that the future of work and the challenge we have ahead are related to digital platforms, the changing skills, to the new labor relations the digital technology is bringing to labor market. But what are the effects in the inequality structure? We have an equal insertion of the social groups on the occupational structure, and we have in Brazil, and I think in India is the same, high inequalities in the educational system. So if we want to take the challenge, the main challenge to take the fourth industrial revolution, we can say the new digital era, the name doesn't matter, and the trends of digitalization in motors for more sustainable and inclusive development, I think we need to think about how societies will choose this destiny, right? And these choices, they are related to the educational systems and the qualification of the labor force. Here I have some figures just to finish in a funny way. We have to think about our digital inequalities, and maybe the most important, this is a picture from the strike of the food delivery workers from iFood, the platform company of the food delivery. And we need to think in alternatives for labor regulation and for our social protection systems. I think this is the biggest challenge the pandemic is bringing to us these days. Well, I'm finishing here. I hope I did not exceed my time, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. That was very interesting. I particularly to note the different kinds of intersections of social group and gender with the impact of the COVID and the pandemic. Now, Dr. Simi, would you introduce the panelists and the order in which they will respond to the comments?
Would you like to go first, Professor Nathan?
Yeah, as I said, okay, I'll just make a couple of brief points. One is, I found it interesting that you did make a difference on the basis of social group and also gender. Usually, particularly in the Brazil analysis, one does not find much importance given to social group. But we in India pay a lot of importance to social groups because, you know, we have the castes and we have the schedule, we have the tribes, and so we have a lot of, and of course also religious minorities. So there's a lot of differentiation of the impact. One question which I have on, which is a broader question with regard to the macroeconomics of the Brazilian situation, that you did have a strong social security system, particularly in the form of Bolsa Familia, which gave a substantial support to all families that were in a way below the poverty line and really helped to reduce inequality in Brazil. But the question is, to what extent was the ability of the Brazilian government to do this dependent on the fact that they earned a lot of oil revenues in that period of the economic history? And has the reduction in the oil revenues had an impact on the fiscal capacity of the Brazilian government to be able to take measures in this pandemic?
Okay. Shall I respond or shall we put different questions together? It's up to you. What's better?
Dr. Prates, up to you. Or we can go just one round to each of our discussants and then come back to you. Would that be fine? Sure. So let me go for further discussion, and so many of points you have also used. So, but one of the sustainable development goals, which was the decent jobs, that has really come at the fore again, which this pandemic has done. So we have our migration and population expert, Professor R.B. Bhagat, joining us from IIPS Mumbai. Sir, over to you, Professor Bhagat. Yes.
And it was very nice listening Dr. Ian Prates, and very exhaustive presentation, very structured presentation, where he has compared what has happened before COVID and after COVID, and then the to extent to which uh, the people or working class lost their job. So there was massive 10 million or more something people lost their jobs, and work participation, that is employment and population ratio, declined something 55% to 50%. This is unprecedented. But then Brazilian society or economy being resilient in the sense that they have enormous social capital and the history of social movement and very strong social policy. And that resilience and the backing of the historical situations context, I think that has helped many poor people. But one thing that is coming out from here, that and Dr. Ayan's presentation, that he has been able to to present or tell that this is happening before COVID and after COVID. Now, in the context of India, we are not able to. Our estimates, you see, are based on guess estimates. Why this is happening so? So this is very appreciable thing for a country like Brazil to have come out with data. Now, who has come out with data is the government or the civil society, that we should try to know, or Dr. Yan can tell us. But we are certainly lacking in data. Even in small matters, like how many people have lost job, or what is that effect, or which sector uh, people have lost job. So this is how we stand in terms of data collection, or in terms of presentation, and our national agency sometimes are not equipped to provide us the adequate data on time. Then this is also very important in respect of with India to learn the digital divide. The digital divide we are not talking about, and this has massively what Dr. Yan has presented. Digital divide, I think, may be much more stronger in Indian context. And that is what is a learning message for all of us. And working from home is a privilege now, is a privilege. And working from home is now a new force of inequality. New force of inequality backed by information technology and this new ICT technology. And this new type of inequality, I think, can deepen our structure, because India is known for social economic inequality. Compared with Brazil, we have more this thing. So I think these are some of the lessons, very important, that digital divide, we should have to research more, and our system, political and economic system, statistical system should come out with better data, and we need more cooperation. I think these are some of the things that flows as a lesson for the Indian context. So thank you very much. Now I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Bhagat. Let me quickly go to Dr. Amrita Pillai, who is a researcher at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, NIPFP, New Delhi. Ma'am, over to you. Ma'am, please unmute yourself. Yes.
Hello. Hi. Firstly, I want to thank Dr. Kumar for inviting me as a discussant. And secondly, thank you, Dr. Ian, for that wonderful presentation. Specifically, very insightful in terms of the before and the after, which, as Professor Bhagat has rightly pointed out, India has not been able to capture very well. So I'll just take a few minutes to highlight what the Indian experience has been like in dealing with the pandemic. And because I am a researcher on the small business ecosystem and the women working within, I'll delve into a little more detail into that. The Indian government announced relief measures, a stimulus package for various stress sectors in the month of May. This included a tailor-made package for the worst hit sectors, one of the worst hit sectors of the economy, which was the MSMEs, which are the micro, small, and medium enterprises. The package had a cohort of measures. It was a mixed bag, but mostly focused on ensuring easier access to finance to tide over immediate cash flow issues that these businesses face because of lockdowns, both at the national, state, and local levels. However, as Professor Bhagat has also pointed out earlier, the true extent of the damage to livelihoods in this sector cannot be accurately determined. Even before the pandemic, the sector has gone through twin shocks in terms of demonetization and the rollout of the GST, the Goods and Services Tax regime. And many businesses may have wound down, and we are simply unaware of this. The last census on the sector was done, roughly 17 years back. So we are just completely in a vacuum with regard to information about the sector. However, we do have national and state field surveys to give us a sense of the magnitude of the problem, really. One thing, however, that is very clear is that the presence of single and micro units, essentially those that employ between 5 to 10 workers, and the vast informality within the sector has clearly exacerbated the way the pandemic has affected them. To give listeners a sense of really the scale that we're talking about, India presently has 63.4 million unincorporated non-agricultural enterprises, excluding construction. Of these, 99% are known to be informal micro units. A predominant share of these are owner-managed units, that is the self-employed. And the next highest share is of those that employ up to 5 workers. The fate of female entrepreneurs and workers within the sector also needs specific attention. I don't think there is any relief measure that the government has introduced which caters to them yet. The presence of female workers in terms of percentage is quite low in the MSME sector, although because the sector itself is so big, the second highest employer in the country after agriculture. In real numbers, the number of people, the number of female workers within is pretty high. So of the 11 crore workers employed in the sector, 24% are female. Of these, 52% live in rural areas. They work in rural areas. As far as ownership is concerned, we see a predominance of male entrepreneurs in the ecosystem. Only around 20.75% of all enterprises in the sector are female owned. Enterprises led by women are generally seen to be very small. So 98% of all women-owned businesses are micro units. So it's either self-employed or those that employ up to 5 workers. There's an urgent need to identify areas in terms of states and sectors where women's participation is high. And there is a need for some specific measures to be introduced to safeguard them. Female LFPR, labor force participation rate, even before the pandemic, was on the decline. So there has to be some measure to ensure that there's not a further steeper decline in this regard. The economic repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic will definitely disproportionately affect women's productive capacities in the sector. There's no doubt about that. Measures to stabilize growth across commercial sectors should take into account the specific needs of women, both as workers and as entrepreneurs. For economic recovery to be sustainable and inclusive, steps at the state level at least, given that there's no central tailor-made relief measure for them, at least at the state level, there needs to be some customized package or some intervention in sectors where there is a high presence of women. Um, of course, we know for a fact that they have historically low levels of, enterprises owned by women have historically low levels of profit margins. They take longer breaks, of unemployment, generally higher rates of unpaid and domestic workload. Um, so the fate of these enterprises and the women working in the sector will be tested in the recovery phase. Um, to this end, it is important that a national database of workers. This is something that the government has announced that it is keen to do, but one doesn't know its status presently. So it is important that this national database of workers in the unorganized sector is created. It has to be taken seriously because we must capture information about where these workers are employed, what their demographic profiles are. It'll just help us effectively prepare for future scenarios of unemployment, of targeted delivery, of social security, etc. So these are some points I wanted to talk about with respect to the Indian experience in dealing with the pandemic. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pillai. Without any further ado, let me go to our next discussant, Professor Vinod Abraham, who is joining us from Center for Development Studies, Kerala. Yes, sir, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ian Priyat. That very interesting lecture. I am audible, I think so. Am I?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I thought that the lecture was quite interesting and quite structured, as the other discussants have already told. Now, I thought, as discussant, I thought I could. There were some very interesting parallels between the narrative that Dr. Prates had shown us about Brazil and what has been happening in India. So I thought, and the narratives are quite interesting in the sense that there are, on the one hand, it seems to be quite parallel, but at some point it kind of breaks away also. So let me just bring up the parallels first, and then show how it looks quite different in the case of India when it comes to the policies that has been attempted with regard to COVID-19 assets. Now, the parallels, starting with the parallels, 2015 to 19, Dr. Prates had been talking about the way in which the crisis has been affecting the Brazilian economy, and the main pointers were with regard to unemployment, inequality, and poverty. Now, India also, roughly the same period, 2014-15 to 2019, the data that, whatever data that we have, shows that the unemployment rates had been increasing. I mean, it had been one of the highest unemployment rates since whenever we had started collecting. Poverty data we don't have. Officially, the data has not been declared, but whatever unofficial data of what unofficial information of the official data that the Indian government has been collecting, it shows that the poverty has also increased substantially. But the government of India has not released this data, but unofficial sources do say that the unemployment rate, the poverty rates have increased. So there is a massive rise both in unemployment and poverty in India. So it's quite interesting that this has been happening in somewhat in the same period. Now, but we must note that unlike the Brazilian story about social security being taken away, the Indian story is not about much about social security disappearing, rather social security not being there at all. It was not about the disappearance of a social security, but rather it's not being there and a crisis coming in place. So that's the kind of parallel that I was trying to draw. Now, coming to the question about how the COVID-19 took place and the policy initiative that these two governments took, it is quite interesting to see that while the Brazilian government, which already had a cash transfer policy that was on for quite some time, right? So, I mean, the amounts had been declining for quite some time, but still the cash transfer policy was there. So a kind of a demand generating policy was there already in place in Brazil for quite some time. Now, in India, what was the approach? The approach was a supply-driven approach. Now, you can see the Brazilian example was Dr. Prates was giving. The credit that was given to the firms, the MSMEs and other firms, that was slow to go down. It was very slow to reach to the public, and to generate enough income growth in the state, in Brazil. Now, what was the approach of the Indian government? Largely, it was the credit. And it was largely about the the supply side provisions that the government of India had been trying. And there has been no attempt, at least very low levels of attempt towards demand generation. The only two attempts towards demand generation was two. One is through the MGNREGs, that is the already existing scheme of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme that exists. That was not a cash transfer scheme, but it's an employment guarantee scheme, some form of a fallback mechanism. It's a kind of a fallback mechanism, which I'll tell you in a moment's time. And the second was to provide with one of the what we call the Pradhan Mantri, the Prime Minister's package towards COVID, alleviation of COVID problems, which was basically providing food subsidies or providing directly food subsidies as such. Now, these food subsidies certainly is some form of a relief, and NREGs is also some form of relief, but none of these are demand generating programs, unlike the cash transfer program, right? So the cash transfer program that existed in Brazil, which was, of course, and what Dr. Ian had already shown, yes, it is the immediate policy impact is going to be short term because it is going to be taken away by December. Many of these policies are going to be taken away by December, and then what is seen as a highly unequal society is probably going to become worse off in Brazil. But here in India, the case inequality, yes, it is there, but I think so the problem for India, it would be much more of absolute poverty than about the story of inequality. Now, why I'm saying is this, that we do not know what, as Professor Bhagat has already said, the data regarding to these information, regarding these aspects is not revealed. It's not out yet. People don't know what has been happening since 2011-12. We don't have any data about the poverty or the consumption data as such, right? Which gives us information about poverty as such. Now, and also we don't have the available information with regard to unequal unemployment shows that the unemployment rates have been increasing also. Now, given this kind of a background, the policies that we had taken up with regard to the what we call the pandemic seems to be quite divergent, both from Brazil and India. So that's an interesting contrast that we see. Though there is a parallel before, the post-COVID or the COVID policy seems to be quite divergent. And the end results, though not comparable, I mean, because we don't have the data to compare it, the end result is also quite interesting. Now, though the national government has not released any unemployment data since the COVID, 2020, whatever information that the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, the CMI data, they do generate data, they show that the unemployment rates during the months of April and May, it had risen quite large in India, reaching up to 23 to 24% during that particular period. And then the unemployment rate falls back to the normal rate. That is, it was about 6% before the lockdown period. For about 2 months, there was high unemployment rates, and then the unemployment rates falls back to normalcy. That is, it falls back to about 6% to 6 to 7%, entirely comparable to the pre-COVID period as such. Now, on the other hand, we can see that in Brazil, the unemployment rate doesn't come down. I mean, it keeps on, it is staggering. It remains quite high, and it remains quite high for the Brazilian population. Now, it's very interesting to see. I mean, I would say, if you look at it, what the difference here is about social security itself. Now, Brazil has a social security, a fallback mechanism for the population to afford to be unemployed. For India, we don't have a fallback mechanism for people to afford to be unemployed. So it looks as if everyone has gone back to jobs, what they were doing earlier, because there was no option. Now, unemployment becomes a kind of an affordable, it's a kind of a luxury in India when you don't have social security, when you don't have any form of fallback mechanism, or any form of sitting at home or searching for job, doing nothing is not a viable option at all. Whatever job is available, in whatever form it is available, you go take it. That's what is happening. So if you don't have social security, probably you end up showing the data being very good. The numbers probably looks very good compared to Brazil, but the underlying story might be quite different from what you see. So that's one of the interesting takes. I think that's one of the interesting takes that we get from comparing between Brazil and India. Now, another one or two things that I thought may be interesting to know from Dr. Prates with regard to the observations that you had made about Brazil is that, see, one of the issues, as some of the discussions had already said, one of the important issues that India had faced during the COVID was the migration issue. Huge amount of people having to move back from their place of work to their places of origin. Now, the proportions, actually, we don't know the numbers, but there are very different claims about what the numbers are. But that was a major crisis. And the crisis kind of exacerbated because there was no coordination between the center and the states, or there was no coordination between the different provinces also within the country also. So it kind of, the what would have been a pandemic related issue converted itself into a political federal state center state relationships as an issue as of that sort. So why is it that Brazil have such an issue, or and if it had, how if it did not have, how is that possible? Because Brazil is also a highly urbanized state with large amount of migration that has occurred, and especially very large cities like India only. But why is it that you don't have that kind of an issue? That's one issue that I thought may be interesting for us to learn from. Second thing, as Professor Devanathan had already raised, is about the issue of social groups. India seems social groups is very important. How does caste, I mean, for us, it is about the different castes and communities in the state, but in Brazil also you have different issues relating to race over there. And how does that reflect? That is not, if you could reflect a little bit more on that. You had, of course, spoken about gender, but a little bit more about the race would have been interesting. And the third aspect that I was showing, also interesting with regard to work from home. Again, the last slide which you had shown, very interesting slide about how it differentiates between the low income group and the high income group in terms of unemployment and work from. But I was also thinking, even within the high income group, for the work from home, I don't know how it works in Brazil, but in India it seems to have the relations of work has changed substantially. Who used to have regular work, they have become piece rate workers and so on. Now, how has that changed in Brazil? That also would be quite interesting to know. Again, thank you very much for that wonderful lecture that you had given. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Abraham, because sir has really touched upon, I would say, really very pertinent points, and two very specific schemes which Indian government launched. One was Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, wherein the Narega and some cash transfer we gave very little amount, I would say $8-9 per month. And then the PDS, public distribution system, and others. Then we also came our another package, which was called Atmanirbhar Bharat package. So there we gave a lot of money to SMEs and all. There is also mid-size and small, those things also coming. I also just wanted to ask one very specific question. That, sir, in your presentation, you have highlighted that the hidden unemployment component, which was around 15% of the 27% overall and 12% which you showed. And so one very interesting graph you also showed, that was on the unemployment and change in work by occupation, different occupation classes. So did you also witness from your study this hidden unemployment being stuck in some of the occupations per se, or how did you find it? Because by income quartile and other things you really saw, but is some occupation like Professor Vinod Abraham also highlighted that the regular work and others have changed since work from home. So over to you, Dr. Prates, or if Professor Nathan, if you'd like to add anything.
I would just like to add one question, and since I have to leave early, I hope Ian would be able to answer it. You see, in India, we saw that in the absence of social security, it was the rural economy that really bore the brunt of the lockdowns and the recession that followed. So with a large number of workers being forced to go back to their rural households for some kind of support. Now, we have seen this in earlier recessions also, even in the Asian financial crisis of 1998-99, when urban employment collapsed in Thailand and Indonesia, the migrants went back to their rural areas. So is there something similar to that in Brazil, or do you not have this kind of rural connection of the large section of the urban working class, which is partly urban, partly rural households, both in both areas, and where there is no social security, then the only fallback is the rural economy itself. So, Ian, would you please like to respond now to the comments and questions which were raised by the various discussants?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the comments. I really appreciate. And I also learned a lot about India with your comments. So I think it makes me think even more about Brazil. And as I was talking to Professor Kuman just before our meeting, I think we have great issues that it's interesting to compare between both countries. I think it sheds some light in the social process each country experiences. Well, I will try to divide my response in some issues, because I think some of you raised similar questions, some different. The first one I will bring is the first Professor Dev just raised in the beginning, related to the crisis and the fiscal crisis, right? The oil revenues. Actually, the declining in the price of oil revenues and all the crises that started on 2014-15, it was also related to some incentives for a specific sector. So the crisis in Brazil after 2015, it is a crisis of expenditures, of expenditures of the government. So certainly the declining in the price of oil and all the commodities price that helped a lot Brazil to develop over the 2010 years had a huge impact, but there were some huge mistakes related to the macroeconomic policies and how to deal with the decreasing oil revenues. And this is one of the main reasons why we had the impeachment of President Dilma in 2015, because she was not very able to, or the economic team, not just the president for sure, they were not very able to manage the economic crisis and the fiscal policies. And then, of course, we had some far right-wing movement that brings together. We have some economic issues that merge with political issues and with conservative trends in the Brazilian society. But if we take the situation now, Brazil was experiencing a huge cut in the expenditures, in the fiscal expenditures and government expenditures. And the pandemic just shown that the situation, at least during the pandemic, should be different. Government and the government need to take a law that we call the war budgets to fund all the social security programs. So this is related to the second issue you raised. How we gonna manage this huge social policy that is the cash transfer benefit in the next years? This is the main issue in Brazil now. If you open the news, if you any journal, any TV, any media, every day the question is the 1 million question, right? How are we gonna fund the cash transfer for the next year? On the one side, we have the Minister of Economy, that he has a more orthodox approach, and he's not willing to continue with this program. He used to say that the program is important, however, we don't have money to do this, because this is almost a new social security program. It's very expensive, and it's not possible to, it's not sustainable in the longer run. On the other side, we have a coalition within the Chamber of Deputies. We have 30 different political parties in our Chamber of Deputies. It's something crazy. This is related to Brazilian governance. But from right to left, all of them, except just one, they agree that we need a more robust social security program. So we are now in this situation that we really don't know what's going to happen, because the budget is a political issue, right? The budget is not a technical issue. It's different groups fighting for their share within the budget of the state and to implement social policies. Well, my opinion, it's my personal opinion. I think we need a social protection program that's bigger and more generous than Bolsa Familia program. But I agree that the one that we have now, it's not sustainable from the fiscal point of view. So the 1 million question is how to fund it. Because it's not related to the amount of the cash transfer, it's related to the criteria of eligibility. Which kind of workers we gonna make eligibility? Just the poorest one? What will be the poverty line? It's just to informal workers or to formal workers who lose their jobs. So we have a lot of technical issues that they are not raised in the bigger political debate. But when we come to the technical debate, we know that if we set one poverty line, the program will cost X. If we set a poverty line that's 20% more, the program will be 3 times this the expenditures, right? Well, my guess is that the government will have no option that is not to continue with some cash transfer program. Also because this program that was giving, and then we come to the political issue, it was giving Bolsonaro some support now. The support for and the approval of the Bolsonaro government now, that's a far right-wing government, comes a lot from people who is receiving this benefit. And when this benefit comes, and we have elections in 2 years. So we have, he needs, well, the main point is within 2 years, if he doesn't continue with the cash transfer benefit, he will lose a lot of approval, and it's very likely to lose the elections, beside all the crazy things he used to do every day. So I won't talk a lot about him because it's not very pleasant. But besides this, I think this is a political issue. This is related to the elections itself. We just have municipal elections and how mayors in cities deal with it. So it is related to this. Well, I'll come to the other questions now. Race and gender or social groups. I totally agree. In the research I worked with, I worked in a very interesting project 5 years ago. It was a comparative project between Brazil and India. And one of the main issues, it was how to compare race in Brazil and caste in India. Because caste in India, it's more institutionalized than race in Brazil. We know that we have a lot of racial inequalities. Racial inequalities in Brazil, it has some roots on the slavery system, but not just that. We know that we have a daily mechanism of discrimination of Black people in Brazil. So we have some political and some racial policies like affirmative policies. But the main point is why Black people, they are more affected within labor market. My answer is 2 main mechanisms. The first one is inequality in the educational system. Black people, they have a more complicated trajectory within the educational system. That's a stratified educational system, and then they are less competitive in the labor market. And you also have a lot of discrimination within the educational system. White students, they are in the better schools, they go to the better universities and so on. And this makes the Black people less competitive in the labor market. But even in the labor market, when they are competing for the best positions, Black people also there is a mechanism of discrimination. So when we analyze the data according to the status of employment, we can see that even in the same occupation, the level of informality, the rate of informality for Black people is much higher than for white people, even if we control for the same occupation. Let's say occupations in the service, you have the same occupation, the same ISO code, let's say, But when you compare the level of informality and access to social security, so on, we have a lot of racial inequality. So I would say that for racial groups, the main mechanism is related to inequality in the educational system combined with discrimination within labor markets. So they are, it's a double disadvantage. For gender, the mechanism is different. What we have for gender, it's actually in Brazil, women, they are more educated than men. So it's not related to inequality in the educational system, but is related to inequalities related to segregation of occupations and also segregation in university. We have all these, let's say, this sexist culture that woman needs to study something. Women will be nurses and men will be doctors. Women will be teachers and men will be engineering, and so on. So this is very related to how we deal with gender issues within our society since the beginning in the educational system, and then we can talk about the educational system. It's not inequality of access, but much more inequality of culture of a patriarchy society, right? And then in the labor market, we also have gender inequalities yes, we have a discrimination process. Women and men in the same occupation, the average difference in wage is around 30% benefiting men. So men, if we control, we run a regression for everything and control for everything, and we have occupation and so on. A woman has a wage 30% less than men. So if these are the mechanisms for inequalities related to gender, and during the pandemic we saw the segregation effect very clearly. And when the government set the main essential economic sectors, the sectors that could not be closed by the lockdown, and then we analyzed this data by gender, we saw that most of workers on the essential services, that is engineering, public utilities, and so on, they used to be men. So because of a segregation process that used to occur before the pandemic, women had to leave the labor market. And of course, we also have the point of the domestic workers. 90% of domestic workers, 93, if I'm not wrong, in Brazil are women. So, and domestic workers, and in domestic employment, we have an intersection between gender and race. So Black women were by far the most affected by the pandemic. We have all this data. They could not, because of this segregation and combined with discrimination, Black women, it was by far the most affected group of the pandemic. Let me come to some other questions you raised, and I agree that the digital divide is, well, we already had a digital divide before the pandemic, and I think the pandemic just strengthened this divide, right? As Professor said, we have now working from home is a privilege, and those who needs to go out to work are the ones who cannot work from home. And in Brazil, 85% of those who are working from home, they have a university degree. So working from home, we have around 10% of people working from home in Brazil during the pandemic. From this 10%, 85 to 90%, they have a university degree. And if we bring the race cleavage to this analysis, we can see that we have twice as more white people with university degree than Black people. So again, due to a reason of the inequality in the educational system, you have different social groups that leads to a segregation, occupational segregation process, and this you have an outcome in the labor market that deeps the inequality of social groups in Brazil. And I think that is something we need to deal with even more. And you, Professor Kuma, you asked about the hidden employment according to occupations. We are not able exactly to analyze the hidden employment about occupations because we don't have the data of the occupation of that individual before. If he's not in the labor market, we don't have the information. Oh, what was your occupation before the pandemic? Unfortunately, we don't have this. But what we know is that most of the hidden employment is of self-employed workers. So, and this affects in a different way. Elderly people, because in Brazil, elderly people is represented in self-employed occupations, and also of young people. So we have this combination, and just to reinforce also of Black people and women. But unfortunately, we don't have the exact occupation, the occupational code we don't have. And you raised some questions related to data. Well, yes, fortunately, the Brazil Statistical Institute they have been very efficient in keeping the labor force survey because they had all the information of the families and the telephone number. So they started to do the labor force survey by telephone, and of course you had some sample that has been lost, but we had a special COVID-19 labor force survey in which we have a sample of 50,000 households per week. So we have a representative sample for every week during the pandemic from May to November. Unfortunately, November is the last month they are doing this survey. Unfortunately, in December they will finish it because of reasons of budget and so on. But yes, and in Brazil we have a registry of formal workers. Every formal worker, it has a registry in the Ministry of Labor, of Ministry of Economy today. So the Ministry of Economy is able to trace the trend of the formal labor market every month. So every month they release the net and the number of dismissals, the number of admissions, and so on. So we have this both source, that is the labor force survey by one side and the administrative data by the other side, that actually helped us a lot to analyze the pandemic in real time, let's say this. A last point, the migration question. Yeah, in Brazil, we don't have this problem because the migration in Brazil, we don't have a strong flux of migration. Brazil nowadays is 92% or 90%, something like this, urban, but different from India, and I think also different from China. We don't have people coming back home. We don't have anymore that person who leaves their village in a rural area, something like this, go to the city to work alone. This happened a lot during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But since the 80s, the urban structure and the rural-urban relation in Brazil, it's much more stable. So actually the migration process, I don't know, I didn't even heard about this in Brazil during the pandemic because no one was worried about this because it's not a real issue in Brazil nowadays.
Yes, but
well, if I forgot something, please let me know because it were a lot of questions.
No issue, Dr. Prates. But yes, one of the difference in Brazil and the Indian labor market really would be the formal and informal. We also have the formal jobs data in form of ESIC and EPFO, which comes every month, just like there. But that is such a less component, I would say 15% of the total. So that really becomes a challenge. That is why the lack of data. There have been few questions on the chat box. I just briefly tell it to you that one question which also came and was on the fiscal side, that don't you think the amount of relief package was high, and couldn't it suffice for Brazil to provide the smaller and sustainable amount of relief and spread it over few more months after December? So these two things always come, that either you reduce the size of the transfers, or reduce the number of beneficiary, or the other criterion as you were mentioning. Another question is that, would you throw some light on the BRICS taking the onus on resolving the pandemic situation? BRICS, all the developing countries. There has been no collaboration on the pandemic on the BRICS platform. What are your recommendations? And one is a very different thing, that the President Bolsonaro was India's Republic Day chief guest. He took the pandemic very lightly, did not impose any lockdowns. Ultimately, people suffered. And how now the Brazil labor market is taking the pandemic, and how serious the situation there now is. And also the developing and developed countries has a very different terms to access to capital or access to finance. How your country is looking at it in the new world order now, and the new normal, if I can say so. Very quickly, Dr. Prates, so that we can once again go to our discussant for any point if they have to make. Yes.
Regarding the first question, it's a very complicated question, not because the question itself, that's very interesting, but the situation it was very complicated. Suddenly, in one day or in 10 days, you had to establish a rule or a criteria to people who need to receive the benefit. I'm not sure if to be very honest, I think that they took a decision that it's called the bureaucracy optimizing decision, right? You have to make a decision. You don't have a lot of information. You have a lot of uncertainty of the situation. Brazil is a federal country, so you have to negotiate with all the 27 states we have and with the Chamber of Deputies. So it was a lot of uncertainty when the pandemic started. And we didn't have any better information and how much it's gonna happen. In the beginning, we thought the pandemic would last just for 3 months. Everyone expected that in July, everything would be normal again. So I think the uncertainty in the beginning of the pandemic may have led to this huge amount of benefit that, of course, is not so huge for the poorest ones, but for the ones in the middle of the income distribution, it's more than they needed. We can say this. I don't like to say this too much, but yes, it's higher than the necessary to in a situation in which everyone is experiencing a crisis. I would go in this direction. I would say that the uncertainty in the beginning of the pandemic, it shaped all the decisions, and some decisions had been not very good. And nowadays we have this challenge in how to keep a program that will provide some security to the poorest population. And let me come to the BRICS. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think the BRICS, it's not very strong now as it has been before, right? I think President Bolsonaro had made some movements towards less stronger relations with BRICS and South-to-South cooperation. We see the same in Latin America. The right-wing movement in Latin America, and Brazil is the biggest country in Latin America, the most developed.
Dr. Prates, are you able to hear us? if you can just conclude, if you are there.
Yes, I was really hoping to listen a little more to Ian. That's why I came back. I finished the other little task I was doing, which was part of a recording. So I was able to come back. But unfortunately, I'm not really able to hear Ian and what he has to say. But as we saw from the presentation that Ian had made, that there has been a huge impact of the pandemic on employment and livelihood in Brazil. And this is differentiated by gender and by social group also, though it overall is very large. The big problem they have is, okay, how will they come out of this in the recovery, and how will they manage their social security program? How will they redesign their social security program after they come out of this long recession? That is a problem that's going to face all of us all around the world. We really have to see how are we going to redesign our social security programs to be able to meet this type of severe contraction, which we've not ever had in our history. None of us can remember something like this. I have lived through a few recessions. Most of you would not know it, but 1965 was perhaps our first recession after the end of the third 5-year plan. After that, then it crashed for a while. But we have never had something of this type. And so how are we going to redo social security systems in a post-pandemic world is a question that comes before all of us, and one that Ian had raised with regard to Brazil. I thank you for your participation, and I hand over to the organizers, to Arjun.
Yes, thank you. No, Ian is saying that some electricity dropped, so he'll just connect with the phone. So no problem. Let me go to our discussion quickly for giving the concluding remarks so that we can wrap well over time. Professor Bhagat, would you like to add anything?
I think very nice discussion, and a lot of things have been made clear, and comparison between India and Brazil. So we are now more enlightened, and we have a better understanding. And we also now understand what are problems, and problems of data is very serious. And the way Brazilian people have done the survey, labor force survey, what Jan has told us, that 50,000 households, and perhaps I think he was telling that per month something was done, that it was not clear to me. So that's very great thing, and that is telephonic survey. So all these, I think most of the points have been raised and discussed. Only one point is coming to my mind, and that is the rural-urban divide. Yes, Brazil doesn't have rural-urban divide the way we have, but then again, urbanization is not only a matter of rural-urban divide, but also it has a form, urban forms, in terms of big cities and small towns. And so we know that Brazil has Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, very big cities. And these cities have favelas, like slums we have. So what is happening in the favelas? And other thing is that Brazil is also, and many Latin American countries, having high rate of urban crimes, drug addictions, trafficking, other things. So urban crimes, what happened during the pandemic? So these are some of the things coming to my mind, but time is, I think, short, and Jan is whether accessible or not, but
No
we
problem.
can keep on discussing. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Dr. Pillai, over to you.
I would like to echo what Professor Bhagat said about data, the data vacuum that we have. And as researchers, I mean, even we have been struggling to assess the before and after, in terms of effects on the small business ecosystem, because that's what I study in detail. And we've been really struggling with it. And like Dr. Ian was mentioning, even a telephonic survey, at such a large scale, could have been done, except that we are so, we have such an informal enterprise ecosystem that we don't know where they are and we don't know how to reach them. So we have to rely on much, much smaller scale surveys that manufacturers, associations, and organizations conduct to really, have a representation of the problem itself. So I think there's a lot to learn from how they have done it there. And this was deeply insightful for me.
Thank
That
you, thank you, thank you, Dr. Pillai. Professor Vinod Abraham, yes, over to you. We don't have data, and now Parliament session is also not there, so we also don't have planning because we have budget coming. So every time we are just, and since Niti Aayog has been built, every year, every month, this is the topic, and 5 years gone. And my yes, my organization is not even 3 years old, and I have done surveys in every 6 months, especially on labor across India. So anyhow, yes, Professor Vinod. Yes.
Yeah, I think most of what we had to speak has been already spoken. Maybe just one or two things. I think there is a lot of learning that can be taken from the pandemic. What we see as the pandemic, yeah, this is a large scale pandemic that has come in. But whatever evidences or whatever predictions that is being made about the future, projections about the future, these pandemics or similar events of such large proportions can be expected in future also, relating to climate change, relating to diseases, relating to natural calamities. The scale of these things are, there seems to be some evidence to show that these things are kind of increasing in terms of volumes and size and all. So I think so we should be thinking about, I mean, since this is a talk that we were talking about two different countries, I mean, there should be larger policies. Our pandemic is is something that has affected all the countries, but there was no uniform way to kind of attack this particular issue. I mean, there should be some kind of, just like organizations that are there across the world, there should be disaster management across the world. And it should not be very specific to, it should not be country specific, like what we see, we have WHO, we have ILO, some such organizations. But is there anything that can actually meet disasters of this scale that affect across countries? I mean, there should be larger thinking about this thing. And I think so the lessons that we learn from one country to ours, I mean, the lessons from Brazil, for example, the social security scheme that they had, problematic as it may be, the social security scheme that they had, that kind of acting as a buffer during this kind of crisis, that's something that we need to learn also. I think I'll stop here with these words. Thank you very much. I think I will thank Dr. Ian and Dr. Professor Devnathan, Dr. Arjun, and Dr. Amrita, and Dr. Bhagat for being here along with me. Thank you very much.
Yes, so let us now wind up some electricity problem also in Brazil now. We get to see. Yes, Professor Devnathan, your concluding remarks if you want to say anything.
No, I think we can end it over here. Everybody has, I think we learned a lot. And as all have pointed out, the comparison between Brazil and India is very useful to see where we come together and where we don't. And it'll be, but one thing is clear, as I said earlier, but one thing is clear, whatever the type of the structure, nevertheless, the importance of putting in place social security systems, which can be automatic and which can come into play when there is a recession, is something that's most important. And we really have to see how are we going to do that in India. We have some kind of rural employment guarantee scheme, which is fortunately there in the rural areas, but we don't have anything similar. And we have to really see what we can put up, even given the fact that we don't find much. We don't find much from the side of the government in terms of what they might like to do in this area. But it is incumbent upon us to really try to come up with some kind of design of a urban employment guarantee scheme, which we call it that, or some kind of urban social security scheme is needed if we are not to go back to that tragedy when we had millions of workers and their families forced to go back home from their urban workplaces. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to IMPRI and thanks to Arjun and all the organizers.
Yes, once again, let me thank all the panelists here and propose this formal vote of thanks. And with this, I would like to wrap and good night, everyone here, and good morning there in Brazil. Thank you. Have a good night.
Okay, good night.